Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and in this podcast, I'm going to talk about this word right here. Ecological, well, it depends on where you live. Some people call it a niche. Some people call it a niche, and some people even call it a niche. And so I tend to call it a niche, but I think that's kind of an American thing, and so whatever we call it, it's derived from a French word which simply means nest. And so a good way to think about a niche is basically your role in an environment. And if we look right here, we see a couple of niches being exploited. And so we've got a rock here, and then we've got lichen that's growing on the rock. And so I can actually see 4 species here because lichen is not one species. It's actually a symbiotic relationship between an algae and a fungus. And they can't live by themselves. But I can see this green lichen, and then I also see this orange lichen growing right here. And they're both exploiting a different niche or a different job. And so one of the first scientists to come up with a good definition for a niche is this guy, George Hutchinson. I love his hair, and I've never been able to figure out what kind of an animal he's holding. It looks maybe like a cat or a monkey. But he defined it as an n-dimensional hypervolume, and so that seems like a crazy term. So what's he really talking about? Well, he's saying let's put on one side some biotic factor or abiotic factor. Let's say on this side we put sunlight, and on this side we put moisture. Well, this is just a 2-dimensional volume, and so basically, or area we would call that. And so let's say that you're an organism that likes a lot of light, so you could survive there, but you don't do well with moisture. Well, then this would be your niche right here. And so it would be this area. But he says there are so many different characteristics, both biotic and abiotic, so we could add temperature, food, predators, all those things. So if you think of each of those being a different dimension, then you would have this complex n-dimensional hypervolume, and it would be this shape that only a species can fill, and none of those species can overlap. So we're getting a little deep. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. So let's say we've got the orange lichen. And the orange lichen likes a lot of sunlight, doesn't do well without sunlight, but can't stand a huge amount of volume of moisture. And now if we look at the green lichen, well, the green lichen likes more moisture, but doesn't do well if we have a whole bunch of sunlight. And so basically, if we put those in the same area at the same time, we're going to see 2 niches. The first one is your fundamental niche. And so your fundamental niche is where you could live. And so in other words, for the orange one, the fundamental niche is going to be this whole area. It could live here, but when you have the green lichen show up, it can't. It's being outcompeted by that green. And so now we would have to give up this section. This actually belongs to the green. And so now the realized niche of that orange lichen is just going to be this shape right here. And so that's one way to think about a niche. Another way to think about it is simply its job. And so let's say you work in a factory. This is an early Ford assembly line. Basically, each of the workers in here have a specific job or a role within this factory. Likewise, in a coral reef, each of these corals is going to have a different role that they play within that ecosystem. And so they're constantly in competition with each other. And in fact, we have what's called the competitive exclusion principle. And that essentially means that you can never have 2 different species filling the same niche at the same time. A better way to say that is that complete competitors, in other words, 2 species that are in complete competitions, doesn't even exist. It's like a fairy tale. And so let me tell you a real story of how this actually plays out. And so this is a coyote, this is a fox, and then this is a gray wolf. And so we didn't have the gray wolf in Yellowstone Park for a long time. And so basically, when the gray wolf was gone, the coyote started to fill that role. And they started to have weird pack-like behavior, and they started to do really well, fill niches that were at one time filled by the gray wolf. As they did that, the red fox population actually went down. They took a hit. And the reason why is that the coyotes were exploiting that niche. Well, now we reintroduce the gray wolf into Yellowstone Park. The gray wolf actually is killing coyotes. Killing coyotes by the thousands. And so when we introduced the wolf into Yellowstone Park, almost immediately 50% of the coyotes were gone. And that's because they were in competition for the same food source, the wolf and the coyote. And so the wolves would target them and kill them. And a pack of wolves against a coyote is no competition because coyotes kind of live this solitary life. They'd simply kill them. And so basically what's happened is the wolves have now taken over that niche that was being filled by the coyote. As a result, now there's less coyotes, and so you could imagine that the red fox population is starting to take off, and so that's pretty cool. Right now, if you go to Yellowstone Park, We've seen selection, and so now we're seeing coyotes that are much larger than they used to be, and they tend to spend most of their time around the roads so they get protection from humans. That's it. That's all I've got on the niche, and I hope that's helpful.
Nature, in all of its perfection, has utilized 16 naturally occurring elements for all living organisms to survive. These elements are known as essential elements, while the rest of the elements utilized for survival may be required in only trace amounts. Every organism is deeply connected to not only the environment around it, but to the other species gracing that particular habitat, and even the functioning of the entire planet. Truly, we are all one, and science proves this truth over and over again. Some factors, however, may exert considerably more influence than others. This concept led to the law of minimum by Justus Liebig. Liebig discovered that the growth of plants in a certain environment depends on the factor that is required in trace quantity and not on the one utilized in large quantities. This discovery came to be known as Liebig's law of minimum. If even the tiniest trace elements are absent, life could be constrained. Truly, nothing is insignificant in nature. Liebig's theory is often mentioned along with Blackman's law of limiting factors. Blackman identified the 5 factors that operate at limiting levels and determine the rate of photosynthesis, namely amount of sunlight, water, carbon dioxide, amount of chlorophyll, and temperature of chloroplast. All environmental factors in nature operate along a wide and beautiful range of intensity. These factors include temperature, carbon dioxide, humidity, sunlight, etc. However, every organism has a unique range of tolerance for any particular factor, so there will be a lower limit and an upper limit of tolerance, beyond which the organism would not be able to survive within that particular habitat. Within this range of tolerance for any particular factor, the organism will have a lower threshold limit or the lower limit of tolerance. If, say, the temperature increases or the amount of carbon dioxide increases above this threshold, the functioning of the organism slowly increases up to a certain limit. Then the organism's functioning will begin to decrease as these factors continue increasing until it reaches a point beyond which the organism cannot tolerate any more increase. At this point, the organism experiences decreasing physiological activity until it reaches a lethal level. The entire set of abiotic conditions such as temperature, sunlight, and carbon dioxide in an environment under which an organism can survive is the range of tolerance. The realization that factors can be limiting at their minimum and maximum level led to the development of law of tolerance formulated by V. E. Shelford. Between the lower and upper threshold limits lies a broad region called zone of compatibility, zone of tolerance, zone of kinetics, or the zone of capacity adaptation. Beyond the upper and lower limits lies the lethal zone of intolerance. Within the broad zone of compatibility, there are regions of physiological stress on either side nearing the zone of intolerance. Organisms feel uncomfortable when the environmental factors near this zone of physiological stress and try to get away from the situation. When the environmental factors approach the zone of intolerance, only a few of the most fit organisms can survive. However, nature does not always operate based on set zone of tolerance. For example, the polar bear hibernates when the temperature falls below the normal threshold level, where the metabolic activity are reduced to bare minimum. Likewise, if temperature rises above the threshold level, some animals undertake aestivation or summer sleep. In general, a population tends to clump together in the zone of compatibility, beyond which only few sturdy individuals can thrive in the zone of physiological stress. Every being has a right to exist in its natural climate, free of pollutions and the devastating impact of global warming. Only when we feel the pain of the suffering life forms everywhere will we be inspired to act in a way that benefits nature, instead of honoring the understanding that all creatures require conditions they have adapted to. Will help us to expand our understanding that we influence nature and will help us feel a responsibility to care for it.